western Montana that evening did not arrive the way rain usually does. It did not build from a drizzle or ease its way in from the edges of the sky. It came all at once like a decision that had already been made, somewhere far above the mountains, dropping hard and heavy across the highway, without warning, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected nothing useful and swallowing the yellow center lines in long, unbroken sheets of moving water. The kind of rain that made the world feel smaller than it was. The kind that pressed the tree line closer and flattened the distant ridge line into a gray smear that could have been anything or nothing at all. Ethan Cross had been driving for 2 hours without a destination. Not lost. He knew exactly where he was. He had memorized the roads around Red Bluff in the first week after he arrived because that was what he did, what he had always done, read terrain before terrain read him. He knew which roads climbed and which ones dropped. He knew where the pavement ended and the gravel began. He knew which stretches of highway went 30 miles without a single turnoff, and he had chosen one of those stretches deliberately because driving them required just enough attention to keep his hands occupied without demanding anything from the part of him that never fully rested. That part of him never rested anymore. He was 39 years old, though he had been told more than once that he carried himself like someone older, like someone who had been given extra years, not as a gift, but as a weight. His build was the kind that came from sustained purpose rather than vanity. Broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, the body of a man who had spent years moving through terrain that punished inefficiency. His face was angular, weathered in the way that wind and altitude and sleeplessness weathered a man with fine lines etched at the corners of his eyes and a jaw set by habit into something just short of a clench. His hair was ash brown, cut short in the same regulation style he had worn for 15 years in the Navy, a style he had never bothered to change because changing it would have required deciding what to change it to, and that kind of decision assumed a future he had not yet agreed to. He wore his uniform, the full Navy working uniform Type 3, the digital camouflage pattern in muted greens and browns, the long-sleeve blouse fitted cleanly to his frame, the trousers bloused over worn combat boots that had walked ground on 3 different continents. He wore it not because he was proud of it, not because he was making a statement to anyone on an empty Montana highway at 7 in the evening. He wore it because he had not yet figured out what to wear instead. Because the uniform told him, even on days when nothing else did, that there was a version of himself that had stood for something, even if that version felt very far away. The truck was old, a dark green Ford F250 with rust along the lower panels, and a cracked sun visor held in place with a strip of electrical tape. The heater worked on good days. The radio had stopped picking up signals 3 weeks after he moved into the cabin, and he had not bothered to fix it because the silence had suited him better than anything the radio had to offer. He did not have music playing now. He did not have the news. He had the rain on the roof and the rhythm of the windshield wipers and the low engine hum, and those 3 things combined into something that was almost enough. Not enough to stop the other sounds. Not enough to push out what gathered in the quiet spaces behind his eyes when the world stopped requiring things from him. But enough to hold back the worst of it the way a levee holds back water, not by strength alone, but by being just present enough to matter. Ethan Cross had come to Red Bluff 8 months earlier because it had nothing he needed to avoid and nothing he wanted to pursue. A small town in the western foothills, the kind of place that appeared on county maps, but not on most people's radar. Scattered storefronts along a 2-block main street, a gas station that doubled as a hardware supply, a diner that closed at 3 in the afternoon, a population that knew how to mind its own business, not out of coldness, but out of respect for the idea that a man's interior life was his own property. He had found the cabin through a notice on a community board outside the post office. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a porch that faced east and caught the morning light, running water that worked most of the time, enough land between him and the nearest neighbor that sound did not carry unless someone wanted it to. He had paid 3 months in advance and had not spoken to the owner since. That was how he preferred it. Not because he disliked people, not exactly, but because every conversation carried the possibility of a question he did not want to answer. And the questions people asked without knowing they were asking them were often the hardest ones. How are you doing? Are you settling in? Do you have family nearby? Simple questions with complicated answers, or rather simple questions with true answers that were not simple at all. Answers that required a kind of excavation. He was not prepared to perform for strangers in parking lots or over counters. He was not doing well. He was not settling in, not in any meaningful sense of the phrase. He did not have family nearby. He had a sister in Oregon he called twice a year, and a mother in Arizona he called less. He had former teammates scattered across the country, men he had bled with and trusted with his life. Men he no longer called because calling them meant talking about the thing that had broken them all open, each in his own private way, and Ethan was not ready to name that thing yet. He was not sure he would ever be. So he drove. On evenings like this one, when the cabin walls closed in at a rate that outpaced his ability to push back, he drove. Not toward anything. Just forward the way water moves down a hillside, taking the path of least resistance. Because the alternative was to stop and be still, and stillness was the one condition Ethan Cross could not yet afford. The shape at the edge of his headlights registered before his mind had finished processing it. Low to the ground, dark against the wet gravel shoulder, moving in a way that was not the movement of debris or shadow or the usual roadside uncertainty that rain created on a highway like this. Something deliberate in it, even as it trembled. Something that belonged to a living thing rather than anything the storm had displaced. His foot eased off the accelerator without conscious instruction. The truck slowed the engine, dropping its hum as his eyes narrowed against the rain in the dark. Through the distortion of water on glass and the sweep of the wipers, the shape began to resolve itself. And in the second or two that it took for what he was seeing to fully register, Ethan's hand had already moved toward the gear shift. He had been about to continue. That was the truth of it, and he would not pretend otherwise, not even to himself. He had seen something, and his first instinct had been to keep going, because that was what the version of him who had come to Montana did. Kept going, avoided the weight of things that required more than survival, chose the forward motion of the truck over the complicated territory of stopping, of engaging, of taking on anything new. He put the truck in park. She was a German shepherd, a female 4 or 5 years old by the look of her, though hardship had a way of blurring the lines of age in animals the same way it did in people. Her coat was black along the saddle of her back, tamahin along her legs and chest, the classic coloring of her breed, though the colors were dulled now, pressed flat against her frame by the weight of rain and mud and exhaustion. She was lean in a way that went past athletic, her ribs faintly visible when the headlights caught her at the right angle, her hip bones sharp beneath the wet fur. Her right hind leg was bent wrong. Not broken, but injured, the joint swollen, and the weight she placed on it uneven, her body compensating with every small shift of position, in a way that suggested the injury was not new, that she'd been managing it for days rather than hours. She was trembling. Not from cold alone, though the rain was cold, and she had clearly been in it for a long time. The trembling was the kind that came from sustained effort, from a body that had pushed past its reasonable limits and had not yet found permission to stop. And she was not standing there alone. Ethan saw them a moment after he registered her. 4 shapes pressed tightly against her underside, visible only because they moved faintly against the stillness of everything else. Puppies, newborns or close to it, their eyes barely opened, their small bodies soaked through their movements, the slow, uncoordinated searching of creatures who had not yet learned how to navigate a world that had already become difficult. The dog was crouched over them, not lying down despite the obvious exhaustion in every line of her body. Crouched with deliberate intent, her shoulders angled forward and down her back curved slightly upward, her position forming a kind of shelter over the small bodies beneath her, blocking the wind, blocking the direct fall of rain, using what remained of her body heat and her body mass to hold back the worst of what the storm was doing to them. Ethan sat with the engine idling and the rain hammering the roof of the truck. And he looked at that dog, and something happened in his chest that he had not expected and did not immediately know how to name. It was the position. That was what stopped him. Not the sight of the dog, not the puppies, not even the injury or the obvious distress of an animal caught in conditions it was not equipped to survive alone. All of those things registered, and all of them would have been enough to give a compassionate man pause. But that was not what held him there, with his hand on the gear shift and the truck idling on an empty Montana highway in the rain. It was the position, the way her body curved over them, the angle of her shoulders, the way her head was bowed, but her eyes were still up, still scanning, still refusing to surrender the awareness of what was around her, even as every physical resource she had was directed downward toward the small lives pressed against her. He had been in that position, not metaphorically, not as an analogy or a resemblance. He had physically been in that position in the dark, in the cold on the ground, in a place very far from Montana, with his body curved over another body and the weight of incoming fire making the air around them feel solid. His name had been Gaines, Marcus Gaines from Beaufort, South Carolina, who had a laugh that carried 3/10 over and a photograph of his daughter taped inside the cover of his field manual. The daughter's name was written on the back of the photograph in Gaines's handwriting. He had shown Ethan once, just once, the way men in those situations sometimes showed each other the things that mattered most quickly and without ceremony because sentiment had to be brief or it became dangerous. The girl had been 4 years old in that photograph. Ethan did not think about Gaines when he could help it. He had built over 2 years a reasonably effective system for not thinking about Gaines. The driving helped. The silence helped. The Montana landscape helped because it demanded a certain quality of attention that left less room for the other kind. He had not expected a dog on a roadside in the rain to dismantle the system in a matter of seconds. But that was what happened. He opened the truck door. The rain hit him immediately cold and full soaking into the fabric of his uniform blouse before he had both feet on the ground. He did not reach back for a jacket. He did not take time to prepare for the discomfort because preparation in a moment like this served the hesitation more than it served the action. And he had already made the decision, and he was not going to let the body's complaints slow it down. He moved toward the dog the way he had learned to move toward anything uncertain, slowly, deliberately. His posture lowered by degrees as he covered the distance, nothing sudden, nothing that announced itself as a threat. His hands visible and empty at his sides. His eyes on her face rather than her body, because the face was where the decision would be made. She saw him coming. Her head lifted despite the effort it clearly cost her the muscles of her neck, pulling against exhaustion, to raise her eyes to his approach. Her body tightened over the puppies, a reflexive deepening of the shelter she was providing, as if she could make herself more solid by intention alone. Her gaze locked onto him with the kind of focus that had nothing passive in it, an active, calculating attention that weighed him against every past experience she had of approaching humans and arrived at something that was not yet trust, but was not yet refusal either. He stopped 6 feet away and crouched, bringing himself down to her level. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain came down between them and around them, and the highway stretched empty in both directions, and there was no sound except the water and the idling engine and the faint, fragile stirring of the puppies beneath her. Ethan looked at her, and she looked at him. He had spent 15 years learning to read threat to assess in fractions of a second the difference between a situation that required force and one that required stillness. What he saw in the dog's eyes was not aggression. It was the look of something that had been failed by trust before and was deciding right now in this moment whether to extend it one more time. He understood that look. He had seen it in other contexts and other places. He had worn it himself in the mirror on bad mornings when nothing made sense, and the world outside the cabin window felt like a problem without a solution. He reached slowly into the front pocket of his blouse and withdrew the single folded cloth he kept there, a utility rag old and soft from use, and placed it on the wet gravel between them. Not as an offering exactly, just as a gesture of presence, something with his scent on it, something that said he intended to remain in contact with this situation rather than pass through it. She watched his hand, watched the cloth, looked back at his face. Her breathing was labored in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He could see the rise and fall of her rib cage from where he crouched, too fast, too shallow, the breathing of an animal that had been running on reserve for longer than reserves were designed to last. He moved closer, an inch at a time, his boots barely lifting from the gravel, his body staying low, his eyes steady. When he was close enough, he lowered himself further onto one knee on the wet ground, the water soaking through the fabric of his trousers immediately, and he extended his hand palm up, not toward her face, but to the side, not demanding contact, but making it available. She did not snap. She did not retreat. She exhaled long and broken through her nose. It was the sound of something that had been holding on very hard for a very long time and had just been given a fraction of permission to let go. Not surrender, not helplessness. Something more complicated than either of those things. The sound of an animal that was still choosing to protect, still choosing to remain, but had just found that it did not have to do it entirely alone. Ethan kept his hand where it was and let her decide. After a moment, her muzzle dropped an inch closer, not to his hand, but in the direction of it. An acknowledgement rather than a contact, that was enough. As he reached carefully, slowly beneath her chest and lifted the first puppy. It was almost nothing in his hands. A weight so slight that the word weight barely applied a small, trembling concentration of life that could have fit in one palm and had skin loose enough to show how much it had already lost to cold and exposure. He pulled it against his chest into the warmth between his blouse and his body, and he felt it stir against him weakly with the specific kind of faint persistence that things have when they are not yet done but are very close to the edge of done. He carried it to the truck and placed it on the passenger floor close to where the heater vents would reach. Then he came back. The mother watched every step, did not follow, did not call out, watched with the complete and unbroken attention of something that had made a decision and was holding to it. One by one, he moved them. 4 trips back and forth in the rain, each time returning to where she crouched, each time lifting another small body and carrying it to safety. By the 3rd trip, she had eased herself slightly, her body no longer at full tension, her eyes tracking him with something that had shifted almost imperceptibly from assessment towards something else. The 4th puppy, the smallest, was pressed furthest beneath her, tucked against her belly, rather than her chest, and when he reached for it, his fingers found fur that was cold. In a way the others had not been a cold that went deeper than surface, and his jaw tightened, because he recognized that particular coldness from other contexts he would not name here, on a wet roadside in the Montana dark. He brought it against his body and held it there, both hands pressed gently around it, and walked back to the truck with his head down and the rain running off the back of his neck. When he returned for the mother, she was already trying to stand fully, her injured leg taking weight that it should not have been asked to take, her eyes already moving toward the truck, toward the sounds coming from inside it. He approached her from the side, not from the front, and when he slid his hands beneath her, one under her chest and one under her haunches, she made a sound low in her throat, not threatening but present a declaration rather than a warning. He lifted her carefully, feeling the real weight of her, now the lean muscle and bone of a dog who had been burning through reserves for longer than was survivable without intervention. She was heavier than he expected for how thin she looked, solid through the core, the structure of a working dog underneath the deprivation. She did not struggle. She released a long, slow breath when he settled her onto the passenger seat, and before he could reach across her to check the puppies, she had already turned, already stretched her neck toward the floor, already begun the quiet, methodical checking of each small body with her nose. 1, 2, 3. She paused at the 4th, the smallest lingering, with her nose pressed against its fur for a long moment, her breathing very still. Then it moved against her, a small, instinctive turning toward warmth. She exhaled again and lay her head down on the edge of the seat and looked forward through the rain-streaked windshield. Ethan Cross got behind the wheel and put the truck in gear and drove. The cabin was 20 minutes from where he had stopped, and he drove those 20 minutes with the heater on full and one hand occasionally reaching down to check temperatures without looking his eyes on the road, his mind running through the next steps with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years thinking operationally under pressure. Heat, dryness, stabilization. The sequence repeating in his thoughts, simple and sequential, because simplicity in crisis was the only thing that worked. When the outline of the cabin appeared through the trees on the rise, he felt something he had not anticipated. Not relief exactly, something more like recognition. The structure looked the same as it had that morning, the same weathered boards and dark windows and porch that faced east, exactly as he had left it. But the act of returning to it felt different from every other night he had returned to it, because this time the truck was not empty and the task was not finished, and there was no possibility of simply closing the door and sitting in the silence and waiting for morning. This time there was something that needed him to continue. He carried the dog inside first, settling her near the fireplace on the braided rug he pulled from the bedroom without deliberating about it. The fire had burned down to embers in his absence, and he fed it quickly, adding wood with practiced efficiency until the flames caught and climbed the light, beginning to move across the walls in the unsteady living way that firelight had. Then the puppies one by one arranged near the hearth on a folded wool blanket he took from the closet shelf, positioned with the careful attention to airflow and proximity that came from understanding how cold worked on small bodies, close enough for the warmth to reach them, not so close that the heat would shock rather than restore. The mother dog moved to them immediately, confirming each one with her nose, checking and rechecking her injured leg, trembling under the weight of even that limited movement. When she had satisfied herself that all four were present and within reach, she lowered herself beside them with the careful deliberateness of something in pain that has decided the pain is not relevant, and she did not take her eyes off the smallest one. Ethan picked up his phone. He did not deliberate over the call. He had noted Sarah Holt's number on a community board in town 3 weeks after he arrived, not because he expected to use it, but because knowing where the resources were was a habit too deep to override. He dialed and she answered on the third ring, and he gave her the situation in 7 sentences, and she said she would be there in 20 minutes. While he waited, he worked. He heated water on the stove and used a clean cloth to press warmth carefully against the paws of each puppy, working slowly and methodically, watching for the small signs of returning circulation. He checked their breathing, counting intervals in his head, the way he had counted things in other situations, where numbers were the difference between action and catastrophe. 3 of them were weak but stable, their breathing shallow but regular, their bodies beginning to respond to the warmth of the room and the proximity of their mother. The 4th one was not stable. He held it. That was all he could do in those minutes before Sarah arrived. He sat on the floor beside the hearth and held the smallest puppy in both hands close to his chest, close to the warmth that his own body generated, and he focused on it with the complete and unhurried attention that he had rarely given to anything in the last 2 years. Each breath it took was a small event. Each pause between breaths was a duration he measured and watched and waited through. He did not pray. He was not sure he still knew how to do that in any meaningful way. But he stayed present in a manner that was close to it, a concentrated stillness that put everything else aside and placed this one small, barely there life at the center of everything that existed in the moment. Sarah Holt arrived at 22 minutes, not 20, but close enough. She was compact and efficient in the way people became when their work required them to make quick decisions in uncertain conditions. Dark hair tied back, a field bag slung over one shoulder, her expression moving across the room in the rapid assessing way that professionals move through new situations, taking inventory before taking action. She knelt beside the mother dog, first her hands moving carefully along the animal's sides, her fingers reading what her eyes could not fully see in the firelight. She pressed gently along the rib cage, along the spine. She paused at the rear haunch, feeling the joint of the injured leg with a careful, focused attention that did not rush and did not comment. When her fingers found what they found beneath the fur of the dog's flank, she stopped, and she looked up at Ethan across the room. Her voice was even, not dramatic, the voice of someone who had learned that the truth delivered plainly was more useful than the truth delivered with alarm. "These marks didn't come from a storm," she said. "This dog has been hit, more than once and not recently. Some of these are healed, some aren't." Ethan did not respond verbally, but his hand, the one still cupped around the smallest puppy against his chest, closed a fraction tighter. Sarah looked at him for a moment and then returned to her work. The knock at the door came while Sarah was working on the smallest pup, which she had taken carefully from Ethan, and was examining by the firelight with the focused intensity of someone buying back something that had almost been lost. The knock was not loud. It was the knock of someone who already knew that quiet was appropriate and had made the adjustment without being asked. Agnes Ward stepped inside with a covered dish in both hands and rein on the shoulders of her coat. She was in her early 70s, solid and grounded, in the way that women who had spent decades on Montana land became grounded. Her silver hair partially escaped from the bun. She had pinned it into her face, mapped by the specific lines that came not from age alone, but from accumulation, from seasons and losses and choices made and held. Her eyes, a soft and slightly clouded blue, moved across the cabin with a sharpness that the surface gave no indication of. She had brought food because that was what she did when something required presence, and she had no other tool to offer. She set the dish on the table and came forward, keeping her distance from the dog by instinct, and she looked at the injured animal for a long moment. A look that carried something Ethan could not quite name, but recognized as knowledge. "I know this dog," she said, quietly without drama. "She's from the Larkin place, 3 miles east past the lower ridge. Boyd Larkin's property." She said the name the way people said the names of things that had weight to them, not loud, not softened, just placed there for whoever was listening to pick up and do what they would with it. "I haven't seen her in a month." Agnes continued, her gaze still on the dog. "Maybe more." She was quiet for a moment after that. "That place," she finally said. "I've heard things from over there, over the years, things that didn't add up to anything good." She did not elaborate, did not explain what she meant by things or what years had carried. She had the manner of someone who understood that there was more to say and had decided this was not yet the moment to say all of it. She looked at Ethan once briefly with an expression that measured him in the way people measured someone they were not yet sure they could trust with the rest of what they knew. Then she nodded toward the covered dish. "There's food there if you need it. The dog will need to eat when she can manage it." She let herself out with the same quiet consideration with which she had arrived. Sarah worked for another hour. She stabilized what she could with what she had administered, warmth and fluids, with the careful precision of field medicine applied to small and fragile systems. And when she had done what was possible, she sat back on her heels and looked at the 4 puppies arranged beside their mother near the fire. "3 of them will be fine," she said. "They need warmth and time. The 4th one," she paused. "The 4th one is going to depend on the next few hours." She looked at Ethan. He was already watching the 4th puppy. "I'll come back in the morning," she said, and she left. The cabin fell quiet. The fire continued. The rain continued outside, though it had eased somewhat, no longer the full weight it had carried on the highway, but a steady, persistent presence that made the cabin feel more isolated than it was sealed in by sound and darkness from whatever lay beyond the tree line. Ethan sat on the floor beside the hearth. He did not try to move the smallest puppy or adjust its position or do anything more than he had already done. He simply stayed close, his back against the stone base of the fireplace, his legs stretched out on the rug, his hands resting on his knees. The mother dog looked at him, not the way she had looked at him on the road, not the wary, calculating assessment of a creature deciding whether the approaching human meant harm. She looked at him in a different way now, something that had come through the road and the rain, and the hours since, something that acknowledged what the last several hours had been without being able to say what it was. He looked back at her with the full attention she had earned, and in that exchange, in that long, unhurried moment, between a man sitting on the floor and a dog lying beside her, puppies in firelight, something settled that had not been settled before. The smallest puppy's chest rose, fell, rose again. Ethan Cross leaned his head back against the warm stone and closed his eyes. Not to sleep. He did not sleep easily, had not since before he could remember exactly when that had changed. But he let his eyes close and let the sounds of the room be what they were, the fire and the rain and the breathing, and he stayed there with all of it, not fighting it and not retreating from it, simply present in a way that he had not allowed himself to be in a very long time. The night moved. The rain eased Sharon further. The smallest puppy breathed on, and Ethan Cross, who had come to this remote and quiet corner of Montana to find a place where nothing required him to remain, sat by the fire with an injured dog and four fragile new lives and did not once think about leaving. That was new. That was the thing that would not have happened a week ago or a month ago or at any point in the last 2 years of driving through the dark and returning to empty rooms and waiting for mornings that arrived without changing anything. The thought of leaving had not entered his mind, not once, not as an impulse or an option or the usual low background pressure he felt in places that tried to hold him. He was here. For tonight, that was enough. The fire settled. The light on the walls grew steadier as the wood caught fully and the flames found their rhythm. Outside, somewhere beyond the porch in the tree line in the dark, wet distance of the eastern ridge, the storm was moving on. Not gone. Just moving the way storms did, carrying everything forward into somewhere else, leaving behind the changed condition of the ground it had passed through. In the cabin, the smallest puppy breathed. Ethan stayed. The days that followed did not announce themselves with any particular significance. They arrived the way most days arrived in that part of Montana, gray at the edges and slow to warm the light filtering through the pines in thin, angled beams that moved across the cabin floor as the morning progressed, marking time in the only way the place seemed to acknowledge it. 1 hour into the next, one breath into the next. The world outside continuing its indifferent turning, while inside the cabin, something smaller and more fragile conducted its own separate negotiation with survival. By the second morning, 3 of the puppies were feeding, unsteady, insistent, crowding toward their mother, with the blind persistence of creatures who had decided the world was worth the effort of staying in it. The mother dog, who had still not been given a name, allowed it with a patience that seemed to exceed her depleted condition, lying still while they worked against her, her focus tracking the room, tracking Ethan, tracking the door and the windows, and the spaces between, maintaining her vigilance, even while she gave everything else away. The 4th puppy was still small, still quieter than the others, but it was breathing with more regularity than it had on that first night, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that had steadied incrementally through the hours of warmth and proximity and the simple, persistent fact of its mother's presence nearby. Sarah Holt had come back on the second morning, as she had said she would check each of them with the same precise attention she had brought the first time, and when she looked at the smallest one, her expression carried something that had shifted from concern towards something more cautious and more hopeful. "Give it another day," she said, "until." Not as a guarantee, as a direction. Ethan gave it another day, and the day after that. He slept in the chair by the fire the first 2 nights, waking at intervals to check temperatures, in positions adjusting the blankets around the puppies, the way a person adjusted things in the dark when sleep was shallow and attention never fully surrendered. It was not the worst sleep he had experienced. That was a low bar to clear, but it was real. On the 3rd day, the mother dog accepted food from his hand. She took it carefully without urgency, with the deliberate dignity of an animal that had not forgotten what it meant to be cared for, but was approaching the memory, slowly testing its reliability before committing to it. He sat on the floor beside her while she ate, his back against the couch, his knees up, not watching her directly, but aware of her in the peripheral way. He was aware of everything now. The way the cabin had become a field of small, meaningful signals that he read continuously without meaning to. She was healing. Not quickly, because the kind of depletion she had arrived with did not reverse quickly, but steadily. The trembling in her injured leg had reduced. The hollowness around her eyes had begun to fill. She moved around the cabin with increasing confidence, though she never went far from the puppies and never stopped watching him with that quality of attention that was neither hostile nor entirely relaxed. Something precisely between the two. The attention of a creature that had revised its initial assessment, but had not yet abandoned caution entirely. He understood that. He respected it. He was operating on something similar himself. It was on the morning of the fourth day that things changed direction. He had come outside onto the porch just after dawn to check the weather and refill the wood box, and when he came back in, she was standing near the east-facing window. Not lying down, not attending to the puppies, but standing with a specific quality of stillness that he recognized as different from rest. Her nose was angled toward the glass. Her ears, which normally track the sounds inside the cabin, were both tilted forward, directed outward toward the tree line, toward the slope of land that descended away from the cabin and continued east through the pines. He watched her for a moment without speaking. She turned her head and looked at him. Then she looked back at the window, then back at him. It was not an ambiguous gesture. It was the opposite of ambiguous. It was the look of an animal that had something to communicate and was applying every capability available to it toward the task of making that communication land. He had seen working dogs operate this way in other contexts, had seen them direct handlers toward things that the human senses could not have located independently, and he had learned in those contexts that the correct response to that kind of signal was not skepticism. It was attention, and then action. "All right," he said. He checked the puppies, ensured they were settled and warm, added wood to the fire, and pulled on his jacket. She was at the door before he reached it. They went out into the cold morning air together, the buggy moving ahead of him down the porch steps with her injured leg, taking the descent carefully, but not hesitating, and across the open ground between the cabin and the first line of trees. The ground was still soft from the recent rain, dark and yielding underfoot, holding the impressions of boots and paws with the fidelity of wet clay. She did not run. She moved with a deliberate, directed pace, pausing occasionally when her leg required it, then continuing her nose low for portions of the route, and then raised reading levels of the air that he could not access. She did not look back frequently, but when she did, she looked back with the specific intent of confirming that he was still there, still following, still committed to wherever this was going. He was. The forest thickened as they moved east and downhill, the pines crowding the path and reducing the light to a diffuse gray that made depth and distance difficult to judge. The ground beneath the trees was carpeted with old needles, brown and matted, and the fallen cones of many seasons, and here and there the exposed roots of large trees that crossed the path like the thresholds of rooms he was passing through one by one. He had walked this direction before in the early weeks of his time at the cabin, when he had been mapping the surrounding land out of habit. He knew the terrain dropped toward a creek bed about a mile east, and that there was an old fence line running roughly north to south, somewhere in that distance, marking what had once been the boundary of a larger property that had been subdivided years back. He had not gone past the fence line. He had had no reason to. The dog went past it. She found the gap in the wire without slowing, passing through with the ease of something that had used this route before, and Ethan followed, holding the wire back from his jacket and stepping through after her, noting that the fence post nearest the gap was pulled askew, the wire holding it loose at an angle that suggested the gap had been used regularly over a long period. On the other side, the land opened slightly. The trees thinned, and through them, perhaps 200 yards ahead, a structure became visible. He saw it in pieces the way things in the woods revealed themselves one detail at a time. First, the roof line dark against the sky, one end sagging. Then the walls boards gone gray with age and moisture, the gaps between them wide in places. Then the foundation, low concrete blocks partly submerged in the earth, the whole structure settling slowly into the ground around it as if the land were in the process of reclaiming it. The dog stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at him. He came up beside her and stood there with her, assessing the structure, the same way he had assessed structures in other parts of the world, reading the visible details before moving closer. The door was on the south face, hanging slightly off its lower hinge but not fully open. The two windows he could see from this angle were dark, one intact and one broken, the glass gone and replaced by a piece of plywood that had warped away from the frame and let in air on two sides. Around the base of the structure, the ground had the particular compression of a place that had seen regular use not recently, not in the last several weeks, but over time. A path worn into the earth on the east side leading from the door toward a wooden post set in the ground roughly 10 feet out. And between the post and the door, lying partially submerged in the mud where rain had pulled and receded a length of chain. He walked to the chain before he went to the door. He crouched beside it, pulling on the work gloves he had put in his jacket pocket when he left the cabin, and followed its length from the post to the far end. It was heavy gauge, the kind used for large animals, and it had been there long enough that the metal had gone deep brown with rust along the links, though the rust was surface level and had not yet compromised the strength of it. The far end had a snap hook, the kind that attached to a collar. The snap hook was open. He looked at the ground around the post. Beneath the surface mud, the earth had been disturbed in a pattern that was unmistakable if you knew what to look for. A roughly circular arc of compressed and churned soil centered on the post, the radius of it corresponding exactly to the length of chain. The pattern of an animal that had moved at the end of a restraint over and over across many days or weeks, wearing the ground down through repetition. The dog was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him. She had not come closer. She was watching with the stillness of something that had returned to a place it did not want to be at, but had come back to anyway because there was something here that still needed to be done. He went to the door. It opened with resistance, the lower hinge dragging against the earth as it swung inward, and the smell that came out was the smell of enclosed space and damp wood and time layered with something older and more complex that he did not try to categorize. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust to the interior. One room, low ceiling, a wooden floor with boards split in several places, light coming through the splits from the dark earth below. Against the far wall, a wooden shelf with nothing on it. In the corner, an old metal bucket on its side, and along the interior face of the door, at a height that corresponded to roughly 2 feet above the ground, a section of board that was marked in a way that stopped him cold. Scratches. Not random damage, not weathering or rot or the casual deterioration of an old structure left to the elements. Scratches made with intention, with force, with repetition over what must have been an extended period of time. Deep gouges in the soft pine, some of them overlapping, some following the same line, as if the same motion had been made again and again in the same place. The wood was pale where the scratches were deepest, the inner layers of the board exposed, and still faintly bright against the surrounding gray. He looked at the height, he looked at the pattern, he looked at the angle of force, the direction the marks had been made, the way they were oriented toward the outside of the door rather than the inside. These marks had been made from within the room, pushing outward. He had seen marks like this before, not in this context but in others, and he understood what they meant. An animal pressing itself against a door, not to escape the room it was in, but to get through the door to something on the other side of it. Not fleeing, trying to reach. He turned and looked at the dog at the edge of the clearing. She had not moved. He looked back at the marks on the door, and something settled into place in his understanding that did not require a chain of reasoning, because some things aligned without the need for logical steps between them. They simply became clear all at once, the way the landscape became clear when the light changed. He stepped back outside. The dog moved then not toward the structure, but around it, circling to the north side where the tree line came closest to the cabin walls, and she moved with a new quality in her step. Something that was more direction than motion, the specific purposefulness of an animal approaching something it had committed to. He followed. She stopped at the base of a large pine, its roots spreading outward from the trunk in thick curved arches that created hollows in the earth between them. She looked at one of those hollows, looked at Ethan, looked back at the hollow. Then she lowered her nose to the earth between two roots and began to push at it. Not frantically, not with the random digging of an animal chasing a scent. Deliberately, with focused, measured movements, her nose and then one paw clearing the surface layer of old needles and loose soil. Ethan crouched beside her. He used his gloved hands to continue what she had started, pushing the soil aside carefully the way he had been trained to handle things in the ground, whose nature was uncertain. Not roughly, not in haste, with the controlled patience of someone who understood that what was beneath the surface might be fragile, and that fragile things, once broken, could not always be reassembled. About 8 inches down, his fingers struck something solid. He cleared more soil. The edge of a box appeared rectangular, its surface rough with rust, wrapped in what had once been a layer of plastic sheeting that had degraded over time into something brittle and partial, still offering some protection, but not the full protection it had been intended to provide. He worked around the edges until the box was loose in the earth, then lifted it carefully and held it in his hands. It was not heavy, the weight of a few papers perhaps. A phone. Whatever had been important enough to someone to seal inside a box and put in the ground beneath the roots of a pine tree in the forest behind a shed on a property that appeared from everything visible to have been deliberately cleared of human presence. He looked at the dog. She had stepped back slightly and was watching him with an expression he could only describe as resolved. Not satisfied, not relieved, not any of the things that a simple reading of the moment might have suggested. Resolved, the look of something that has carried a responsibility for as long as it could carry it and has now found the person to whom the responsibility can be transferred. He understood the weight of that transfer. He did not take it lightly. He did not open the box there in the trees. He stood, tucked it under his arm, and turned back toward the cabin, and the dog followed him the full distance, side by side this time, rather than leading her injured leg, carrying her with the slow, careful steadiness of something that had already spent everything it had and was moving now on something other than reserve. Back in the cabin, the puppies were still sleeping. The fire had burned down, but not out, and he fed it again before sitting at the kitchen table with the box in front of him. He removed his gloves, looked at the box for a moment, then opened it. The lid resisted the rust, having worked its way into the seam over however long it had been in the ground, but not so deeply that it could not be broken with careful, steady pressure. It gave with a sound like a small exhale. Inside, moisture had done damage, but not total damage. There was a plastic bag sealed with tape, and inside it, protected better than the other contents, a phone-its screen dark and its battery certainly dead, but its casing intact. Beside the bag, wrapped loosely in a cloth that had once been a kitchen towel, a folded set of papers, and beneath the papers several photographs, their edges curved from humidity, but their images still visible. He unfolded the photographs first. A woman, dark-haired, slender, her face carrying the kind of composure that people wore when they had learned to keep their interior life off their surface, when the distance between what was felt and what was shown had been maintained so long it had become structural. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more. In the first photograph, she was standing in a kitchen, a child beside her, both of them turned slightly toward the camera, in a way that suggested the photograph had been taken quickly without full arrangement, grabbed rather than posed. The child was a girl, small, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with her mother's dark hair and eyes that were serious in the way children's eyes were sometimes serious when the world around them had given them more information than children were supposed to have to process. In the second photograph, the same woman was seated outside in better light, and in this one, the marks were visible on her forearm. Faint, but they're the kind of marks that had explanations that did not hold up to examination. In the third, the child was alone, holding something toward the camera, a piece of paper, a drawing, and she was smiling, but the smile had the quality of something performed for the benefit of the person behind the camera, rather than something that arose naturally. He set the photographs down and unfolded the papers, medical forms, several of them from different dates spanning more than a year, the name at the top of each one partially obscured by a fold that had set into the paper but visible enough. Delia Larkin. The dates ranged across 14 months. The notations were in the abbreviated language of medical documentation, clinical and precise, and they described injuries in the neutral terms that medicine used for things that were not neutral at all. Lacerations, contusions, a fracture noted as consistent with impact rather than fall. The reasons given in the forms for each visit cycled through a small set of explanations that did not vary enough to suggest anything except that whoever had provided them had not been required to provide anything more convincing. He set the forms down beside the photographs. Then he set the phone beside them and sat back in the chair. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pines with the low sound that wind made in Montana when it came down off the higher ridges and found its way through the trees, a sound that was almost like breathing if you listened to it in the right frame of mind. He sat with what was in front of him on the table for a long time without moving. The dog came to him. She crossed the cabin floor without her usual caution and came to the side of the chair and placed her chin on his knee, a gesture so deliberate and so uncharacteristic of everything she had shown him in the 4 days since he had brought her in from the road, that he looked down at her with the full attention he had been giving the table. She held his gaze without wavering. "I know," he said, the first words he had spoken to her directly, and meant them in the full sense of what they covered: the box, the photographs, the marks on the door of the shed, the chain in the mud, all of it. He knew. He was still sitting at the table when the sound of a truck reached him. Not Sarah's vehicle, which he had learned was a small pickup with a worn engine note. Not Agnes's, which rattled on the uneven approach road in a specific rhythm he had cataloged in the first visit. This was heavier, a larger engine, not new but maintained the kind of truck that working land required. It came up the approach road without hesitation, as if the person driving it had driven it before or had driven up roads like it enough times that no road presented uncertainty. The dog moved before the sound had fully registered in his conscious attention. She was on her feet and across the room before Ethan had risen from his chair, pressing herself into the corner near the woodpile, her injured leg braced beneath her. Her body gathered inward in a way that was not defensive in the sense of preparation for a fight, but in the other sense, the older, more frightened sense, the sense of making yourself small when small was the only option available. He had seen her guard. He had seen her threaten. He had seen her exhausted and depleted and uncertain. He had not until this moment seen her afraid. He went to the door. The man who got out of the truck was in his mid-40s, built broadly across the chest and shoulders in a way that had been substantial once and was still present, though the years had added other things to the frame that work and discipline would have kept off. His face was wide with the remnants of features that might have read as commanding in youth, now thickened slightly and marked around the eyes by something he had not put there deliberately, but had not managed to remove either. He wore a canvas work coat and boots that had real mud on them, not the decorative mud of a truck commercial, but the mud of someone who moved across land that did not accommodate cleanliness. In his left hand, he held a set of papers folded once. He tapped them against his palm as he closed the truck door with his right, a small repeated motion that had the character of a habit rather than impatience, the movement of a hand that was accustomed to having something in it and felt incomplete otherwise. His eyes found Ethan on the porch immediately, and they were pale, a washed-out gray, and they did not settle when they found their target, but continued to move, taking in the cabin, the windows, the surrounding area. The truck Ethan had parked at the side, gathering information with a speed and thoroughness that was practiced enough to look casual. Boyd Larkin did not look like a man who had come to start trouble. He looked like a man who had come to conclude it. "Name's Larkin," he said from 10 feet out. His voice was level, conversational, with the particular ease of someone who had rehearsed the opening of this scene enough times that it came without effort. "Boyd Larkin, I've got property east of here. I think you may have found something of mine during the storm." He extended the paper slightly. Ethan did not move from the porch. "My dog," Larkin continued, "in a litter she dropped. German Shepherd, black and tan. She got loose during the storm, which happens. Animals get spooked. I've been looking for her since." He paused, the pause of a man allowing time for agreement. rather than expecting disagreement. Looks like you did a good thing picking her up. I'd like to take them home. Ethan looked at the papers in the man's extended hand. He looked at the man's face. He looked at the truck behind him, at the mud on the tires at the set of his shoulders, at the particular quality of the stillness he was maintaining, which was not the stillness of a relaxed man, but the stillness of a man who was managing something beneath the surface with considerable effort. He did not step off the porch. She didn't seem to know she was lost, Ethan said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation delivered in the same conversational register Larkin had used, and it landed in the space between them without expanding into anything larger. Just placed there, something for the other man to do with. Larkin's expression did not change, but something in it shifted in the fraction of a second after Ethan's words arrived, a micro-adjustment that a person watching for it would notice, and a person not watching for it would miss. He recovered immediately, his voice maintaining its level tone. Animals act strange after a storm. Fear does things to behavior that don't make a lot of sense to us. She'll settle when she's back in familiar territory. Deputy Lena Voss arrived 15 minutes later. She had not been called by Ethan, not directly, not about this specific situation. He had given her a general picture of the dog's condition and the evidence of injury on his initial call, and she had said she would check back in. She had chosen to check back in today, and her timing had the quality of either coincidence or good instinct. And Ethan had long since stopped assuming coincidences were simple. She was tall, blonde hair, secured at the back of her head with the practicality of someone who had stopped thinking about her hair in professional contexts and started thinking about everything else. Her uniform was clean, and her posture was the posture of someone who had trained it there and no longer needed to think about it. Her eyes moved over the scene from the moment her vehicle stopped reading, Larkin reading Ethan, reading the space between them. She accepted the papers from Larkin and read them with a thoroughness that was deliberate, her expression giving nothing away. She took more time than the papers required. That extra time was not wasted. It was pressure applied quietly. When she looked up, she looked toward the interior of the cabin, the door partially open, the dim space beyond it. Somewhere in that space, the dog was pressed into her corner, invisible from the porch, making no sound. The animal doesn't appear willing to return, Lena said, her voice carrying the flatness of someone stating an observable fact rather than offering an opinion. Larkin's answer came quickly. Like I told him, animals behave differently after a storm. Fear affects their responses. You can't read anything into it. What I can read into is the physical condition she arrived in, Lena said. Dr. Holt has documented her injuries. Some of those are old. She held Larkin's gaze. That becomes relevant to how we proceed here. For the first time, something moved beneath the surface of Boyd Larkin's composure. Not openly, nothing that would have given a casual observer anything to point to. But Ethan saw it because he had been watching for it the way he watched for everything, and what he saw was the slight tightening around the man's eyes that indicated the situation was not moving in the direction he had mapped out on the drive over. Larkin mentioned a name then, not prominently, not as a threat exactly, but placed into the conversation with careful deliberateness. The county sheriff, a long acquaintance, someone who would confirm that the paperwork was in order, that the matter was straightforward, that there was no complexity here that required this level of attention. Lena received the name without visible reaction. Documentation doesn't resolve condition of welfare, she said. The animals remain where they are pending assessment. I'll be in touch when there's something to communicate. It was not a dismissal in tone, it was a boundary in content. And the distinction between those two things was the thing that made it harder to argue with. Larkin stood for a moment in the space where a man who had expected a different outcome stands recalibrating. Then he nodded once with a tightness that was not agreement, but was the shape that agreement made when worn by someone who had decided this was not the right moment for the alternative. He got back in his truck. Before the door closed, he looked at Ethan. Just a look, no words. The look of a man who was not done and wanted the other man to know it and who had enough experience with situations like this one to be patient about the timeline. The truck reversed down the approach road, and the sound of it faded east. Lena stood on the porch for a moment after it was gone. "I know that name," she said. Not to Ethan specifically, just into the air. "I've heard that name before in a context that didn't settle." She looked at him. "What's in the cabin beyond the dog?" He told her about the box, about the photographs and the medical forms, about the phone that needed someone with the right tools to open it. She nodded slowly. "I know someone," she said. Everett Briggs arrived the following afternoon, and he brought with him the particular kind of quietness that investigators carried, a quietness that was not passivity, but concentration. All the attention pulled inward toward the work, and very little of it left over for the social mechanics of introduction and small talk. He was lean, early 40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples and rectangular glasses that he pushed up once when he entered the cabin and did not touch again. He looked at the items on the table, sat down in front of them, and opened the compact kit he carried with the focused efficiency of a craftsman laying out his tools. The phone took time, time that had its own texture, the particular weight of waiting in a space where the outcome mattered, where the people in the room were not passing time, but enduring it, each minute containing more density than minutes usually did. Ethan stayed across the room near the fire, near the dog, who had come out of the corner now that Larkin was gone and had returned to her position near the puppies. Lena stood by the window. Nobody spoke much. When the screen came to life, it came in fragments. An operating system damaged by moisture and time, reconstructed piece by the tools Briggs applied to it, giving up its contents the way old things gave up their contents, reluctantly and incompletely, but giving them up nonetheless. What was on the phone was enough. Text messages sent to a support line number, the kind of messages that took a long time to write and were sent in the middle of the night when the alternative was silence. Messages that did not receive replies for days and then received the automated reply of an overloaded system and then nothing more. Photographs taken inside the house at the Larkin property, taken quickly at odd angles, the kind of photographs taken by someone who needed to document something and had very little time in which to do it. A note typed into the phone's own memo application and dated 8 months ago that read, "In full, if anyone finds this phone, we tried to leave. We tried to find help. The dog's name is Raven. She tried to protect us. Please find out what happened here." Briggs read it and set the phone down carefully and looked at Lena. "Delia Larkin," he said, "and a child." He paused. "I can find them." The room held the weight of that sentence for a moment. Then Ethan looked at the dog, at Raven, whose name he now knew, sitting beside her puppies in the firelight, her steady presence filling the room with something it had not held before she arrived. She had come back, not been lost. Come back. She had carried the location of that box in her memory across whatever distance and difficulty separated the shed from the highway, had waited injured and depleted until someone stopped, and had then led that someone back to the things she could not carry herself. That night, Ethan sat on the porch after Lena and Briggs had gone. The air was cold and clear, the sky above the pines carrying more stars than clouds for the first time since the storm, and the sound of the forest at night was the sound of living things going about the business of being alive in the dark, the small sounds of movement in breath and settling. He had been sitting there for an hour when he heard it, a sound from below the porch. Not the forest, not an animal from the tree line, a sound from the direction of the approach road, a careful sound, the sound of something that was trying not to make sound and was very nearly succeeding. He did not stand. He did not call out. He sat in the darkness of the porch without moving his senses, expanding outward the way they had expanded in other places on other nights, when the darkness was full of things that had not yet declared themselves. The sound moved around the south side of the cabin, paused, moved again. It remained outside. It did not approach the door. And then it stopped. After a long moment of complete stillness, a truck engine started somewhere down the road, not at the approach to his cabin, but on the main road further than a person walking would have parked if they intended to arrive openly. It drove east. Ethan sat for another 20 minutes, letting the night settle back into its ordinary sounds. Then he rose and came down the porch steps and crossed to the bottom step, where something light and pale was visible against the dark wood. He crouched. A leather collar, cracked with age and darkened by use, the kind of collar that had been on an animal for a long time. He did not need to examine it closely to know whose collar it was. He had felt it around Raven's neck on the night he lifted her from the road, had noted its wear, the way it had pressed into the fur beneath it over months or years of continuous use. It had been cut. A single clean cut through the leather, the edges sharp rather than frayed, done with something with a blade. He held it for a moment in the dark, the damp Montana air around him, the pines pressing the stars into narrow corridors of light above his head. Then he went inside and he called Lena Voss, and his voice when he spoke was level and quiet and entirely clear. The morning after he found the collar, Ethan did not drive. He stayed close to the cabin, moving through his routine with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that the situation had entered a new phase, and that new phases required different kinds of readiness. Not the readiness of action, not yet. The readiness of patience. The readiness of a man who had learned the hard way that moving before the moment was right cost more than waiting ever did. Lena had driven out the previous night after his call and had walked the perimeter of the property with a flashlight without making a production of it. She had not found anything beyond what Ethan had already found, and she had not pretended otherwise. Before she left, she had said simply that she would increase her drive-bys on this road for the next several days, and that Briggs had been notified. No promises beyond what she could deliver. That was the kind of person she was. Ethan had understood and had not asked for more. Raven seemed to understand the change tempo as well. She did not press toward the door the way she had on the fourth morning. She moved through the cabin with a steadiness that had not been present in the first days, her injured leg carrying more of her weight. Now the swelling at the joint reduced to something that Sarah Holt, on her most recent visit, had said would continue to improve with time and rest. She ate with regularity. She attended to the puppies with the focused, unhurried care of a mother who had passed through the acute phase of crisis and arrived at the longer, quieter work of raising. The puppies themselves had become something different from what they had been on the first night. They were not yet fully steady on their feet, but they moved with the clumsy, insistent energy of creatures who had decided the world was interesting and wanted to explore its perimeter. They tumbled over one another near the hearth, piled together in sleep, with the unself-conscious completeness of animals who had not yet learned to hold anything back. The smallest one, the one he had held through the first night with both hands pressed around its body, counting breaths, had caught up to its siblings in a way that felt to Ethan like something he did not quite have language for. Not a miracle, because he did not use that word easily, but something in that territory, something that had not been guaranteed and had happened anyway. He was at the table with a cup of coffee when Agnes Ward knocked, and he knew by the specific quality of her knock that she had not come for the usual reasons. Not food, not the easy sociability she had begun to offer in the days since everything had started. This was a different knock, purposeful in a way that held urgency behind it without allowing the urgency to show on the surface. He opened the door and she came in, and she looked at him with the direct steadiness of a woman who had spent the night deciding something and had arrived having made the decision fully. "There's someone you and Deputy Voss need to speak with," she said. She's been ready to speak for longer than she's known it. She just needed to see that someone was actually listening before she could say anything out loud. He called Lena. Edna Stafford lived in a small house set back from a county road 3 miles north, a house that had the character of a place inhabited by a single person for decades. Everything in it adjusted to one life's rhythms and requirements. The furniture arranged for one person's comfort, the kitchen stocked for one person's appetite, the silence inside it, the particular silence of a place that had been quiet for so long, it had stopped registering quiet as absence and had started registering it as texture. She was in her early 70s, her build small and slightly stooped, her white hair cropped short and practical, her hands roughened from decades of outdoor work, her face carrying the patient lines of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching carefully and saying very little of what she saw. Where Agnes carried her years in a kind of grounded solidity, Edna carried hers in stillness, in the particular quiet of someone who had trained herself not to react until she was certain of what she was reacting to. She brought them tea they had not asked for and set it on the table between them, and sat across from it without taking any for herself, her hands folded on the tabletop, her eyes moving between Ethan and Lena, with the careful assessment of someone measuring the reliability of her audience before committing to what she had come to say. Lena sat with her notepad closed. That was a deliberate choice, and Edna noticed it. She began to talk. She talked about sounds, the sounds that carried across the open land between properties in the late evenings, when the wind came down off the ridge from the east and the night was clear enough for sound to travel the distance between her house and the Larkin property with nothing to absorb it. She described what she had heard in the careful, measured language of someone who had replayed the memories enough times to have worn away their most jagged edges. What remained was accurate, but no longer raw. Arguments that escalated in a particular direction, one voice louder than the other, in a specific ratio that did not suggest disagreement between equals. The sound of objects being broken. Silences that came after those sounds that felt from a distance worse than the sounds themselves. And the dog, she said. In the early months she had heard the dog. Barking, not the intermittent barking of a dog reacting to wildlife or weather, but sustained, concentrated barking. The kind that had a target, the kind that came from an animal interposing itself between something and something else. Then the barking had stopped. Not gradually, it had simply stopped 1 week and had not resumed. She had called the sheriff's office once, she said. 8 months ago, approximately. She described the call in a few sentences, the report she had made, the response she had received, which amounted to a notation taken and a promise of follow-up that had not followed. She had not called again. She had told herself that she had fulfilled her obligation, that the system was designed to handle things like this, that her continued involvement was not required or perhaps not appropriate. She said this without self-exoneration. She said it as fact, as part of the account, with the clarity of someone who had already adjudicated her own role in the silence and had arrived at a verdict she was not disputing. I should have called more than once, she said. That's all. Lena wrote nothing down during the account. When Edna finished, Lena looked at her for a moment and then said simply that her account was valuable and that it would be part of the record going forward. She said it without embellishment and without the kind of reassurance that could have come across as minimizing. Just acknowledgement, plain and true. They drove back toward Red Bluff without speaking much. The landscape on either side of the county road moved past in the clear morning light. The mountains visible, now that the storm was fully gone, the higher peaks still carrying snow that caught the light and held at the lower ridges brown and dark green and immediate. Montana, in the aftermath of weather, had a specific quality of definition, as if the storm had cleaned the air of everything except what was essential. Briggs found them, Lena said when they were 2 miles from town. She kept her eyes on the road. Delia and the girl, they're in Billings, a shelter there. They arrived 9 days ago. She was quiet for a moment. They're safe, physically. Ethan looked out the window at the passing tree line. Boyd still has legal standing to pursue contact, Lena continued. The shelter placement isn't permanent protection. Without the documentation, without the formal record, he could apply for access through the family court, and the timeline on that would not be in their favor. She paused again. With the documentation, with Edna's account, with what's on that phone, the picture is different. When can Briggs have the full analysis ready? Ethan asked. He's working on it now. The phone data combined with the medical forms gives us a timeline. Edna's testimony fills a gap in that timeline that would otherwise require explanation. She turned her signal on for the road that led back toward the foothills. There's one more thing that would close it completely. She did not say what the one more thing was. She did not need to, because Ethan was already thinking about the photographs in the box, the woman and the child's serious eyes, and the question of what a 5-year-old girl who had grown up in a house with a locked door and a chained dog had retained in the way that children retain things not as narrative, not as organized memory, but as expression, as drawing, as the unfiltered visual record of a mind too young to know what should be kept and what could be shown. Lena called him the following morning. She drove up to the cabin with another vehicle behind her, a county vehicle he had not seen before, and when both cars stopped and the doors opened, the first person out of the second car was a woman who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating terrain that was unfamiliar, not in the physical sense, but in the deeper sense, the terrain of returning to a proximity she had worked very hard to put distance between herself and. Delia Larkin was perhaps 32, her build slender but carried tightly, as if the muscle of her had contracted inward over time and not yet received permission to release. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a way that was functional rather than styled. She wore a coat that was clean, but not hers, the fit slightly wrong across the shoulders in the way borrowed things fit. Her face was composed with the composure of someone who had learned to maintain it under conditions that would have dissolved a person who had not built that particular skill out of necessity. She stood beside the car for a moment looking at the cabin, not at Ethan on the porch, at the cabin itself as if she were reading it, assessing it, deciding whether what it contained was something she could be in the proximity of. Then the small door of the second car opened and a child came out. Gracie was 5 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and the solemn observational quality in her eyes that Ethan had seen in the photograph from the box. She stood close to her mother's side, one hand finding Delia's coat automatically, and she looked at the cabin with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a child who had not yet learned to pretend that looking was anything other than looking. Lena walked toward Ethan. Delia and Gracie came behind her. Delia's pace measured her eyes, now moving from the cabin to the porch to Ethan with the same careful assessment she had given everything else. She wanted to come, Lena said quietly when she reached the porch, when I told her where the dog was. Ethan held the cabin door open and stepped aside. What happened in the next few minutes did not belong to any category of things he knew how to narrate directly, because narrating it would have required him to stand outside it, and he was not outside it. He was in the room when it happened, and what he observed was this. Raven had been lying near the puppies when the door opened. She rose as people entered, her body moving to its alert posture, her focus going to each new person in sequence, with the quick reading attention she brought to any new presence in the space. When she reached Delia, she stopped. Not the stopping of uncertainty, not the pause of an animal deciding whether the person in front of it was familiar or not. The stopping of recognition, complete and immediate, something that required no decision because no decision was being made. The recognition had already existed, had been existing for however many months, separated now from the last time these two had been in the same place. And what happened when Raven's eyes found Delia was simply the closing of a gap that had remained open through all of that time. Raven crossed the room, not rushing, not with the uncontrolled eagerness of a guy reuniting with a person it loves in ordinary circumstances. With something more careful than that, more deliberate, more weighted, the approach of an animal that understood the particular fragility of the moment it was entering. She came to Delia and she stopped 2 feet away and she looked up at her. Delia lowered herself to the floor. It was not a graceful movement. It was the movement of someone whose legs had stopped cooperating with whatever instruction composure was trying to give them, a descent that was more of a giving way than a choice, and she was on her knees on the cabin floor in front of Raven, and her hands came up slowly, and she pressed them into the fur at Raven's neck, and her face went down and she was silent. Raven pressed forward, her injured leg trembling slightly under the changed weight distribution but holding. She pressed the full weight of her head and neck against Delia's shoulder, and she was still. Gracie watched from near the door, her hand still at her side. Now her mother's coat no longer in her grip, because her mother was no longer standing beside her. She watched what was happening in the center of the room with the complete, clear attention of a child who understood this not as a concept, but as a reality, who had been waiting for this moment in whatever way a 5-year-old waited for things, not consciously but continuously. The room was silent for a long time. Ethan stood near the wood stove. Lena stood near the door, Neither of them moved. After a while, Delia raised her head. Her face had not broken apart, not in the way of someone overwhelmed, but it had changed something in. It had released something that had been held under sustained pressure for a long time and had just been given by the specific form of Raven's weight against her shoulder permission to set itself down. She spoke quietly to no one, specifically looking at her hands in Raven's fur. She told it without drama. That was the first thing Ethan noticed, the complete absence of performance in the telling. She was not narrating for effect. She was completing a record, putting the true account into the air of the room, because the room was now a place where the true account could exist without consequences she was no longer able to endure. She described what the years in that house had been, not cataloging every event, not building toward anything, just laying down the shape of it, the way it had been in the beginning. The way it had changed incrementally, the specific skill Boyd had for making each escalation feel like the logical continuation of what had come before, so that the distance from where things had started to where they had arrived was only visible if you stepped far enough back to see the whole of it at once. And stepping back had not been available as an option from inside it. She talked about Raven, how the dog had been Boyd's initially a working dog, a guard animal kept on a chain at the periphery of the property in the way that working dogs on that kind of land were kept. How over time Raven had repositioned herself, not by any action Delia had encouraged or even noticed as a pattern until it had already become one, but by a series of small, deliberate choices the dog had made, placing herself between Boyd and Delia, during arguments, moving to Gracie's room at night, when tension in the house rose to a level that required navigation, pressing herself against the interior of the shed door when Delia had been locked inside it. There had been 2 moments, she said, when Raven had done more than position herself. The first time Boyd had stepped back. The dog had surprised him. That had been the first time and the only time that particular approach had worked. The second time he had not stepped back. After the second time, she said he had loaded Raven into the truck and driven away. He had told Delia the dog had been taken to a shelter. She had known that was not true, had known it with the specific certainty of someone who had learned to read the gap between what Boyd said and what Boyd did, but she had had no recourse and no ability to know what had actually happened. She paused then, and something crossed her face that was not grief, but was in the same family as grief, a kind of retrospective ache for things that could not have gone differently given what was known at the time. She was pregnant when he took her, Delia said. I didn't know for certain, but I suspected. I think that may be part of why the man he gave her to couldn't go through with what Boyd asked. She was quiet for a moment with that. What had actually happened then, she continued. She had only learned from Lena the day before that the person Boyd had given the dog to had not followed through on what Boyd had asked. That Raven had been released rather than destroyed, turned loose on the road south of the county line, with no collar and no direction, and every reason in the world to simply disappear into the landscape and never be found. She said this, and she lowered her face again into the fur at Raven's neck, and she stayed there for a moment. Then she raised her head, and her voice was steady when she continued. The box, she said, she had put together over the months before she finally left. The medical forms she had requested copies of on the pretext of transferring to a new provider, a new town, a new doctor, explanations Boyd had accepted because he did not think she had the capacity to act on them. The photographs she had taken in the brief periods when the house was empty. The phone she had bought with cash from a grocery run and had kept hidden in the lining of a coat he never looked at. She had put it all in a box, and she had given the box to Raven, not metaphorically. She had placed the box at the base of the pine behind the shed on a day when Boyd was away, and she had shown Raven where it was, and she had said to the dog directly, and without certainty that it meant anything, that if something happened to her, if she could not come back, if they left and did not return, whatever was in that box needed to be found. She did not know whether Raven had understood the instruction in any cognitive sense. She knew that Raven had memorized the location in the way that certain dogs memorize locations that had been marked as significant, and that when Raven had escaped from where she had been left, she had not run toward any random freedom, but had come back to that place, had come back and waited and found the right person to bring. Gracie moved then away from the door and across the room to her mother, and she sat beside Delia on the floor and leaned against her, and Delia put her arm around the child without interrupting what she was saying, the motion automatic and complete the motion of a woman for whom the protection of this small person had been the organizing principle of every decision for years. Then Gracie looked at Ethan. She was 5 years old, and she had her mother's serious eyes, and she held his gaze for a moment with the frank, direct consideration of a child who had learned to read adults as a survival skill and was applying that skill now. Then she reached into the front pocket of her small coat and withdrew something folded. Several pieces of paper folded together soft with handling the kind of softness that came from being taken out and looked at and put away many times over a long period. She held them toward Ethan. He crossed the room and crouched to her level and took them carefully and unfolded them. They were drawings, made with crayons on notebook paper, the kind of paper that came in a child's school folder, and they had been made by a 5-year-old hand, unsteady lines and imperfect shapes, and the particular visual logic of a child who drew what she knew, rather than what she saw from the outside. In each of them, the same figures appeared. A large figure and smaller figures, a woman and a child, the scale between them preserved consistently across all the drawings, the relationship legible, even in the imprecise language of crayon. In some of the drawings, the large figure had its arm raised. In some of them, the woman figure had marks on her that were not present in others. Marks added with a different crayon. The specific deliberateness of a child recording something she had observed and believed was important to record. In several of them, near the edge of the composition, there was a big drawn in black and brown, sometimes standing and sometimes on its side, sometimes with a line around its neck and sometimes without. In the last drawing, the dog was between the large figure and the smaller figures. Standing between them, front legs braced the crayon lines of it, heavier than in the other drawings, pressed harder into the paper, as if the weight of what was being depicted had transferred into the hand that made it. Ethan looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking. When he looked up, Gracie was watching him with the same direct, clear attention, waiting to see what he did with what she had given him. "Thank you," he said to her directly as he would have spoken to an adult, because what she had handed him was not a child's artwork. It was a record. It was testimony. It was 5 years old, and it was the clearest account in the room. He looked at Lena. Lena was already reaching for her phone. Everett Briggs drove out that afternoon and sat at the table for 2 hours. He went through the phone data, the medical forms, Edna Stafford's written account, which Lena had transcribed and which Edna had signed, and now the drawings, which he handled with the same careful seriousness he had brought to everything else. He had also, he said, without elaborating, pulled the veterinary intake record from a county clinic 30 miles east. A single visit a dog brought in 18 months prior, the intake form, noting injuries to the rear joint described as consistent with blunt force impact. The name on the record was Larkin. He laid it on the table with the other items without comment because it required none. When he had gone through everything, Briggs sat back in his chair and removed his glasses and set them on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "There's nothing here that doesn't point the same direction," he said. "Every piece supports every other piece. The timeline is consistent. The pattern is documented." He put his glasses back on. "It's a complete record." He looked at Lena. She made the call that evening. Boyd Larkin was located the following morning at a property 2 counties east, a parcel he owned under a business name that had required some tracing to connect to him. He was in the process of loading the bed of his truck with materials that Briggs would later describe in his report as consistent with someone who had decided to reduce the number of things connecting him to a specific place and had run out of time to do it carefully. There was a brief reflexive resistance, the kind that came from a man whose entire operating system was built on the premise that force resolves situations, encountering for the first time a situation that force could not resolve because the situation was already concluded in a space he could not reach with force. Deputies from 2 counties were present. The resistance lasted approximately 40 seconds, and then stopped, not because Boyd Larkin had changed his mind about anything, but because there was nothing left for the resistance to push against. Lena had driven out. She stood 30 feet back from the arrest itself, her hands in the pockets of her jacket, her posture easy in the way that the resolution of something long wound tight produced ease. She watched the process complete itself with the quiet attention of someone who had worked toward a specific outcome for a specific period and was now observing that outcome take its final form. When the car doors closed and the vehicles moved out down the county road, she stood for a moment in the space they had vacated. The land around her quiet, the morning sky vast and clear, the mountains in the distance unchanged by anything that had just occurred at their base. She drove back to the cabin. Agnes was already there. She had arrived as she had a way of arriving at the precise moment that her presence was useful with food, and a quietness about her that was not the quietness of someone with nothing to say, but of someone who understood that saying things at the wrong moment was a form of taking space that did not belong to you. She set what she had brought on the table, and she stood near the window, and when Lena came in and said what she had to say in a few simple words, Agnes nodded once and looked out the window at the pines and did not say anything at all. That kind of silence was its own form of completion. The legal process took 10 days. It moved at the pace that these processes move, methodical, and documented each step, requiring the previous step to be fully established before the next one could proceed. Briggs submitted the evidentiary package on the second day. Delia's formal statement was taken on the fourth. Edna Stafford's signed account was entered into the record on the 6th. A county court judge reviewed the welfare documentation regarding the animals on the 8th day and signed the order that transferred legal custody of Raven and her 4 puppies to Ethan Cross, recognizing the documented conditions under which the animals had been held and the documented injuries consistent with deliberate harm. On the 10th day, Lena brought the papers to the cabin in person. She set them on the table and slid them across to Ethan, and he picked them up and read them and set them back down. He did not make a production of the moment, but he did not dismiss it either. He sat with it for a moment, the weight of a piece of paper that made formal what had already been true in every way that actually mattered, and he acknowledged that formality with the brief, quiet attention it deserved. Lena left an envelope on the corner of the table when she went. She did not mention it. He opened it after she was gone and found a folded card with a program name and a phone number, a veteran support organization that works specifically with former special operations personnel. No note, no explanation, just a card placed in a space where he would find it without being handed it, the difference between those two things being the difference between an offer and a pressure, and Lena Voss understood that difference clearly. Sarah Holt came the day the paperwork was finalized. If she had known, which perhaps she had, through the network of small-town communication that moved faster than its participants generally acknowledged. She checked each of the puppies with her usual thoroughness, noting their weights, their responsiveness, the state of their eyes and ears and coats, and when she finished, she stood and looked at them, all the 4 of them, and their mother moving around the cabin floor with the easy confidence of animals that had fully arrived in the place they were going to be. "They're healthy," she said, the simplest and most complete sentence available. She left her number on the counter with a note that read in Sarah Holt's efficient handwriting, "Call if you need anything for them or for you." It was Gracie who named the smallest one. Delia and Gracie had come back to the cabin on the day before they were to be relocated to a more permanent placement, a transitional housing program in Missoula that Briggs had connected them with a place with proper resources and time and the kind of steady support that a single cabin in the foothills could not provide. They had come to say goodbye to Raven, and Gracie had spent an hour on the floor with the puppies, each of them investigated thoroughly by her small and careful hands. Each of them granted the specific and complete attention that Gracie brought to things she considered important. She had picked up the smallest one last, the one that had been coldest on the first night, the one he had held in both hands through the dark counting breaths, the one that had come back from an edge that had been very close. She had held it against her chest the way Ethan had held it, both hands cupped around it, and she had looked at it for a long moment with her serious reading eyes. "Lucky," she said, quietly, as if she were confirming something that had already been decided and she was simply making it official. Ethan looked at the puppy and then at Gracie and said nothing because there was nothing to add to it. She was right. That was the name. Delia said goodbye to Raven for a long time, standing at the door with Gracie at her side, one hand resting on Raven's head with the unhurried ease of someone no longer counting the seconds available to her. She had the quality of a person who was leaving something she loved in a place that was safe, which was a different thing entirely from leaving something she loved and not knowing where it was going. The grief and the relief were both present in her face, and she did not try to separate them. "She saved us twice," Delia said, not to anyone in particular. "First time by staying, second time by leaving." Ethan stood in the doorway as they drove away, and he watched the car until it had rounded the bend in the approach road, and the sound of it had faded into the distance, and the trees had closed behind it completely. Raven stood beside him, her shoulder against his leg, watching the same direction. That night, for the first time since he had come to Red Bluff, Ethan Cross slept through until morning. Not deeply, not entirely without the shapes that moved through his sleep in the dark hours, because those did not simply stop. He had not expected them to stop. But when the flashback came, as it came in the way it always came, not summoned but arriving on its own schedule with the authority of something that had decided it would not wait, it was different this time. Not the fragment, not the portion he had been able to bear and no further. The whole of it complete from beginning to end without the merciful truncation that his mind had applied in every prior visit to that territory. Gaines, Marcus Gaines, from Beaufort, South Carolina, who had a laugh that carried 3/10 over, and a photograph of his daughter taped inside the cover of his field manual. They had been pinned for 11 hours in a position that should have been untenable for 11 minutes, and Ethan had kept them alive through those 11 hours, through a combination of training and discipline and the specific, uncomplicated decision that nobody was going to die on his watch if he had any say in the matter. He had not had a say at the end. Gaines had died at the 10-hour mark from a wound that nothing available could have addressed, from a damage that exceeded the resources of the situation, and there was nothing that Ethan's training or his discipline or his decision had been able to do about it. He had been there for it. He had been holding Gaines's hand when it happened, the way men held each other in those moments when there was nothing else available, when the full extent of what could be offered had been reduced to presence. That was what he had carried for 2 years, not guilt, or not only guilt, the heavier thing, the thing that did not have a clean name, the thing that sat in the space between I survived and he did not, and asked in the quiet moments whether that differential meant something, whether there was a debt attached to it, whether existence itself required a justification that he had not yet been able to provide. In the dream he saw Gaines's face clearly. He had not been able to see it clearly in the 2 years of fragments. He saw it now in full the way a person's face looked when they had accepted something and were no longer afraid of it, the peace that came into a face at the end of things when the struggle was concluded. And then the dream shifted the way dreams did without logic, but with the specific logic of the dreaming mind that makes its own connections through different channels than the waking one, and he saw Gracie. Sitting on the cabin floor with Lucky held against her chest, her small hands cupped around the smallest puppy, her serious eyes looking at it with full and unhurried attention she brought to things that mattered. And the feeling in the dream at that sight was not the feeling of payment on a debt. It was not justification. It was not the closing of a transaction. It was something else entirely. It was the simple, plain recognition of a reason. Not a reason that erased what had happened or resolved it or completed it. A reason that existed alongside it, that occupied the same space without requiring the other to diminish. You can carry the weight of what was lost and still have a reason to remain. Those two things were not in opposition. They had never been in opposition. He had only believed they were because he had not been able to see them both at the same time until now. He woke to morning light crossing the cabin floor and the long, angled lines that the east-facing windows made of the early sun moving slowly from the door toward the wood stove as the minutes passed. The fire burned down to a low red bed of coals, the sound of the pines outside carrying the particular quality that Montana pines had in the early morning before the wind found them. Raven was at the foot of the bed. She had not been there when he went to sleep. She had chosen sometime in the night to move from her usual position by the hearth. To this position closer, her body a warm weight at the end of the mattress, her presence steady and undemanding and entirely real. He lay still for a moment looking at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the cabin. The puppies were audible from the main room, small movements and small sounds, the sounds of things that were alive and intended to remain so. Outside, the wind had not yet come down from the ridges. The sky through the window was the deep, clear blue that followed a weather system completely the blue that meant the storm was done and not coming back. He got up. He built the fire from the coals without thinking about it. The sequence automatic now, the morning routine of the cabin, as natural as the morning routines of any place a person had decided to actually inhabit rather than simply occupy. He fed the puppies, checked their water, stood in the kitchen while the coffee heated, and looked out the window at the clearing in front of the cabin and the trees beyond it and the mountains behind those, everything sharp in the morning air, everything defined. Raven came and sat beside him. He looked down at her. She looked up at him with those amber eyes, the same eyes that had assessed him from a roadside in the rain, and had made a calculation and had extended something he had not expected to receive. And he looked back at her with the attention she deserved, the full, unhurried attention of a man who was no longer trying to be anywhere else. He thought about the envelope Lena had left on the table, the number on the card. He had looked at it 3 times in the last 10 days, each time putting it back without doing anything with it. He thought about it now without the resistance that had been present in those earlier moments, thought about it as a thing that existed in the world and that he was capable of reaching toward. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and when he did reach toward it, it would not be because someone had told him he should, or because the situation required it, or because he had decided there was an obligation attached to his continued survival that needed to be serviced. It would be because he wanted to, because he had something now that made the future tense feel different than it had made it feel less like a problem and more like a direction. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold, the particular cold of a Montana morning, in the days after a storm clean, in a way that went deeper than temperature, the kind of cold that made the edges of things precise. The clearing in front of the cabin was bright in the early light, the ground still holding the moisture of the recent weather dark and rich, and beginning here and there at the margins to show the first tentative green of things deciding to grow again. The 4 puppies came out behind him in a loose, uncoordinated rush, tumbling over the porch step, with the reckless momentum of creatures who had not yet learned to be cautious, spreading out across the clearing, with the completely committed energy of animals discovering open space for the first time and finding it entirely satisfactory. Lucky came last, smaller than the others, deliberate in a way the others were not stepping off the porch with the consideration of something that had learned at an early stage not to take solid ground for granted. Ethan watched them from the porch. Raven came and stood beside him, her shoulder at his knee, and she watched them too. And the morning moved around all of them, the light changing as the sun climbed the shadows, shortening the mountains, holding their distance and their silence and their indifferent permanence. He looked at the mountains. He looked at the clearing. He looked at Lucky, who had stopped in the middle of the clearing and sat down and was looking back at him with a directness that had more of Raven in it than anything else. That same quality of attention that missed nothing and surrendered nothing and waited without impatience for whatever came next. Ethan Cross was 39 years old, and he had come to this remote corner of Montana to find a place where nothing asked him to remain. He had found instead the thing that was harder to find and more necessary, the thing that a man could not build for himself from the inside but could only arrive at from the outside, through the specific form of something that needed him to be exactly who he was and exactly where he was and nowhere else. The war was still there. It would always be there the way certain landscapes were always there in the body of someone who had moved through them, changed into the cellular memory of every choice made and every weight carried across difficult ground. He was not under any illusion that what had happened in the last 10 days had reached into that territory and altered it. But the war was no longer the largest thing in the field of view. He stepped off the porch and walked out into the clearing, and Lucky came to him immediately tumbling over its own feet in the hurry, and he crouched down and let it climb his hand and looked at it for a moment, the small, solid, specific reality of it, and then he stood again and turned and looked at the cabin. Weathered boards, porch facing east, a wood stove that worked and a fire that was already going. Four walls and a roof and the smell of coffee coming through the open door. Raven watched him from the porch, her posture easy, her attention steady, waiting without any urgency for whatever he decided to do next. He walked back to her. He put his hand on her head for a moment, just a moment, the brief acknowledgement of one living thing to another across the distance that always remained between species, no matter how much trust had been built, and she leaned into it slightly without surprise as if she had expected it to happen eventually and had been patient about the timeline. Then he went inside. The door did not close behind him with the sound of retreat. It closed with the sound of a man entering a place he had decided to be a place that held the ongoing work of days that stretched forward in a direction he had not expected to want to travel, and found now that he did. The fire was warm. The coffee was ready. Outside, the four puppies were learning the edges of the clearing with the complete and trusting commitment of young things who had no reason yet to doubt the ground beneath them. Lucky sat in the middle of it all and looked at nothing and everything with those serious, steady eyes already more present in the world than the world had given it any reason to expect to be. And the mountains held their distance, and the morning continued, and in a remote cabin in western Montana, a man who had come looking for a place to disappear had found instead in the form of a broken dog and four small lives in the stubborn persistence of a truth that refused to stay buried, something he had not known he was looking for. A reason that was his own, a ground worth holding.